Good morning. Thanks very much indeed for that introduction. So the talk today is entitled "What Next? What Next for Europe?" Rather sort of a bold prediction, and I hope to maybe shed some light on that in the next half an hour or so. Now, every British journalist worth their salt has their Boris Johnson story. So here's mine. The first time I heard the name Boris Johnson, or really sort of appreciated the phenomenon of Boris Johnson, was back in 1995 when I was working in Russia. And I was quite keen to leave Russia and get another job somewhere else because I'd been there for 6 years and it was very exciting, but the novelty was beginning to wear off a little bit. And I was asked by the Sunday Times if I would go to Brussels, be their Brussels correspondent, and as they put it, do a Boris for them. Now, do a Boris for them? I said, what do you mean, do a Boris for you? And they said, well, write the kind of stories for the Sunday Times that Boris Johnson has been writing for the Daily Telegraph. Now, I was in Moscow. We didn't get the Daily Telegraph. In Moscow, there was no internet. I had absolutely no idea what kind of stories I would be writing, or he was writing, and I thought, fine, okay, I can do that. So I shook the snow from my boots, well, not much snow, it was April, traveled to Brussels, and once I reached Brussels, it didn't take me very long to realize the full enormity of the task that I'd taken on. Boris himself had just left, I think about a month or so before. He'd gone from Brussels back to London to sort of continue his ascent onwards and upwards. To say he'd been forgotten would be something of not been forgotten, rather, would be something of an understatement. To say he was fondly remembered would not be accurate at all. It just struck me. In fact, actually, have we got a picture of him? Yeah, that's him. That's the Boris from about that period. So it's quite a striking figure, even those back in the 1990s. So as I set out to try and be a Boris, I sort of looked at some of his greatest works. One of my favorite example of his oeuvre, I think, was the European Commission considering plan to blow up Berlaymont building to deal with asbestos problem, which somehow sailed through the fact checkers at the Daily Telegraph. He also had his fair share of bent banana and bent cucumber stories and so on. I don't remember him waving around any kippers, as he did recently, with the same disregard for truth that's characterized his career. But I soon found very soon that it was very difficult to do a Boris. And so it's a little bit ironic that all these years later, like him or loathe him, Boris Johnson is now, in one of these sort of neat twists at fate, in charge of efforts, or Britain's efforts, to leave an organization that he spent much of the early part of his career essentially deriding and mocking. You'll be relieved, I think, that I'm not going to go into all the minutiae of the latest British government proposal on Brexit this morning. We don't want a collective glazing over of eyes. I think it would be a little bit also like in 1920s Germany when there was hyperinflation and people would sit down for a meal and find at the end of it that the prices have changed. Who knows where we will stand with Brexit half an hour from now. But my aim in my capacity as Europe editor of the Sunday Times, who continued to pay my bills 25 years on, thankfully, is to give you a flavor of how things look from the other side of the channel, from which obviously a lot of you come anyway, and also what kind of Europe will be left after, I was going to say when, if, I don't know quite what the right word is, Britain leaves. And I mean, it's significant because due to, I suppose, a coming together of things, the scheduled departure date for Brexit, October the 31st, also coincides with the beginning of the tenure of the new European Commission under Ursula von der Leyen, also the new Christine Lagarde is going to be running the European Central Bank. So it's quite a pivotal moment for the EU with all these different factors coming together. Now, if we step back a bit, I think it's difficult often to appreciate the significance of events when you're in the middle of them. But I think, if we go forward in time and then look back, as it were, I think that probably the period we've had from 2016 to 2019 will probably be seen as sort of almost as much as a turning point for Europe and the world as the period from 1989 to 1991, starting with the Berlin Wall and ultimately with the fall of the Soviet Union. It was obviously not just the Brexit vote in June 2016, which was a very, very significant event. We also had the election of this guy, which to many of us at that time, I was the foreign editor of the Sunday Times back in London, right up till the day before. Our Washington correspondent, who was meant to be very well informed about these matters, was convinced that he was not going to win. He did win. We should have seen it coming. A lot of other people should have seen it coming. These two events were within a few months of each other, were clearly happening in different countries, in part due to different factors, but also perhaps relating to broader issues, broader discontents common to a lot of people in Britain and to America, people in America. I mean, what was the problem? To some extent, let's say whole books have been written about the factors behind Brexit, the factors behind Trump's triumph. I suppose what essentially it boils down to is a rather belated response to the economic crisis of 2008 and of the following Euro crisis, the feeling of compressed living standards, the feeling of a kind of unfairness felt by a lot of people that the spoils of economic growth, to the extent there was in that intervening period, had been unfairly shared. And there was also, I think, broader kind of cultural concerns linked with issues like immigration, linked with the rise of a more liberal culture, I think, in both countries, and there was a kind of a pushback against that was very skillfully exploited by Donald Trump, and also exploited, I think, by those behind the Brexit campaign. And this was obviously not just something affecting those two countries. We can see, if you look back over this period, the rise to power, in fact, predating Trump, the rise to power of Duterte in the Philippines, subsequently the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil, a new generation of leader who had a very particular populist, often right-leaning outlook on life. Now, this was obviously not just confined to those further reaching parts of the globe. It was also very much a European phenomenon. It's something I've experienced firsthand. I've had the pleasure since September of last year of being based in Paris as the Europe editor of the Sunday Times. And I went to Paris and I was sort of looking at what my predecessors had done, and I was sort of settling down to think, okay, I provide what in newspaper jargon is known as the fluffy stuff. In the paper, I'll be writing about wine and about food and about presidential sex scandals and all that other kind of stuff that people turn to on a Sunday morning over their breakfast cereal for light relief. So there I was one day in my local bistro, obviously researching the material, peered over the top of the menu and began to see rather a lot of people wearing high-vis yellow jackets. Here's a rather photogenic group of them. There we go. Now, my first thought, of course, was that their cars had all broken down on the autoroute. They dutifully brought on their vests and had gone off in search of a local garagiste. It obviously wasn't true. As time went on, there were more and more of them around the place. They tended to congregate day and night at roundabouts in provincial French towns. I had a very interesting experience of going out to a number of these encampments, which are really quite extraordinary social phenomena, and I think sort of whole books will be written about people there. And what's more, large groups of them took to coming to Paris, mostly on a Saturday. The general pattern was they'd arrive in the early morning, wander around aimlessly but angrily for a few hours, and then start smashing stuff up. On one particular occasion, I think this is probably taken from that day, they daubed slogans on the Arc de Triomphe, got in and smashed up the exhibitions inside. Things did get quite nasty. The police response, French police take no prisoners, as anyone who's ever seen a French riot in action will testify. This went on for many, many months, but it wasn't just France that was full of angry people. Germany I have to go to quite a lot, cover as part of my job. There were whole waves following from 2015 when the gates were thrown open, as it were, and about 1 million migrants came into Germany. There began to be attacks on asylum centers. There began to be weekly marches by a pretty fearsome far-right group called Pegida in the east of the country. People were also beginning to vote quite strongly for a party called the Alternative for Germany, the AfD, which was pretty hostile to migrants and pretty hostile to Europe as well, to the EU. In Italy also we saw a kind of a rise of populism with the formation of a quite curious coalition government in the spring of last year, featuring as its sort of leading member a gentleman called Matteo Salvini. A little bit of the modern-day Mussolini's about him, perhaps one might say, who didn't much like migrants either. So the expectation was certainly in late last year, early this year, in the run-up to the European Parliament elections, that this was going to be a big standoff between liberal Europe, the Europe of the liberal elites, as I think critics have tried to decry it, and these popular forces. So we had the election, as ever with elections, particularly European elections. It was quite difficult to read. A lot of people did vote for anti-establishment parties, mostly on the right, some of them on the left, but the majority of people didn't. So ultimately, they ended up with perhaps about 20% or so of the vote, which hasn't brought them a huge amount of influence. Now, even though, say, in some countries, some far-right parties have joined governments as junior members, there is a sense now, though, in the past few months, that we perhaps have passed peak populism. Things are perhaps not going quite their way. I think most symbolic was the fate of Matteo Salvini. Here we are. Now, he's the gentleman with the phone on the right there, who this summer was convinced, as part of his own political career-making, that he would go campaigning on the beaches. So people would be lying there on their stretched out on their sun loungers in Bibione or in Milano Marittimo or wherever. Up would pop Salvini. I'm not sure many British politicians certainly could carry that off. I wouldn't like to see Boris with his top off. Leo Varadkar, I don't know, maybe? Who knows? Anyway, it didn't go very well for him. He tried to break up the coalition in the hope of getting an election and getting himself back in with a majority. He succeeded in the first part of that, essentially got thrown out of the government, no election, and he's now fulminating away in opposition. There have been other developments in recent weeks to suggest this kind of populist tide has been receding to some extent. Just this past Sunday in Austria, they had parliamentary elections where the far right's share of the vote plunged from about 26% down to 16%, which is quite a dramatic drop. You know, that being said, all the underlying problems which fueled this resentment, which fueled this support for populists, haven't gone away. And on top of that, of course, we have Brexit. Now, I mentioned at the beginning this is not going to be a talk about Brexit, but obviously I have to mention it. Sorry. So, since arriving in power, where's he gone? There he is. Boris Johnson has brought, let's say, a slightly different flavour to British government from that of Theresa May, and also quite a different attitude towards Europe. I mean, I think, if one were to sum up Johnson's position succinctly, it is that essentially May's failure, as I think as one commentator put it, was the failure in the deal that May did were caused essentially not by the weakness or mistakes in the British position, but just by a failure of nerve. That in a sense, all you needed to do was to see Britain was serious about leaving, to see this intent, almost a kamikaze light in our eyes, and that somehow Brussels would just kind of collapse, would crumble in the light of this sort of onslaught of the great British army with this great lumbering creature that is Boris Johnson at the head of it. Well, it's not quite turning out like that. I mean, for a long time there was no engagement whatsoever. Then Johnson's various underlings, negotiators, started going to Brussels. It was quite instructive. I have to sort of shuttle quite a lot between Paris and Brussels. What was quite interesting, a couple of weeks ago I was up there and I did the rounds of the British side, and they've been having sort of various technical talks or presenting what in EU jargon is known as non-papers, which are basically sort of ideas for thoughts or whatever. And the British side would say how well things were going, and then I would go off and see Barnier's people, and there was just despair, really. I mean, let's see, Barnier has this. Yeah, that's it. That kind of feeling. Now, at that point, the despair was a little bit that Britain hadn't actually put forward any formal proposals at all, and so it was a kind of, well, what do you expect us to react to if you're not going to propose something? Now that has changed. I mean, in planning this talk a few weeks back, I couldn't have imagined that we would have found ourselves exactly at the crucial moment, essentially, between Britain having finally put forward its proposals and the EU formally reacting to them. I mean, essentially, we don't need to go into all of the details of it, but what is essentially the British aim is that Northern Ireland, for an initial 4-year period, should be aligned with the rules on the single market, not just in agriculture, but in industrial products and so on. However, Northern Ireland is, under this proposal, going to leave the customs union with Britain. Now, there are all sorts of problems from an EU point of view with this deal. I mean, let's say the EU has been polite. Of course, they have to be polite. Everyone is trying to be polite. On receiving the deal, Jean-Claude Juncker has talked about positive steps, but said there are problematic points. Leo Varadkar has been a little less appreciative. Because, I mean, fundamentally, there are issues such as, under the British requirements, Northern Ireland will leave the customs union, which means some form of border arrangements, even if they're not a physical border, will be required if we're going to maintain the integrity of the single market. So there is going to be a lot of toing and froing on this in the next few days, next few weeks. I think there is a fundamental unwillingness on the British side to accept what really sort of underlines all of this, which is the so-called Brexit Trilemma, which is illustrated beautifully simply in this diagram, which is essentially Britain wants to leave the single market and the customs union. It wants no Irish Sea trade border between Northern Ireland and Britain. It wants no border checks in Ireland. Can you get all three of those? No. You can get two, you can get any two, but you can't get three. And this creature in the middle, anyone at the back who can't see it, this is, of course, a unicorn. If I'd had a bigger photograph, probably there would have been Boris Johnson riding on the unicorn. So I was, whenever I see this diagram, I always chuckle and sort of thought I would share it with you. So, who knows? We've got a summit on October the 17th in Brussels, which I suspect is going to be interesting, very interesting. We have Brexit date, October the 31st. If you kind of count back from that, can they, with the best goodwill in the world on both sides, and that might be an optimistic assumption, can they actually get anything together in time for that? It not looking great. Will they have to ask for an extension? How will Boris avoid asking for an extension? Everything is going to be determined, really, I think, in the next few days, weeks. But let's go on from Brexit, though. And so let's make a perhaps heroic assumption that Britain does leave the EU. What is going to happen now, Europe? How is Europe going to develop without Britain? Well, for the past 5 years, the European Commission has been in the safe hands of Jean-Claude Juncker. There we are with a... sorry, that's inappropriate. No better at all. Anyway, he's off to spend more time in his wine cellar or vineyard or wherever. His place is being taken by a much more sober-minded woman, Ursula von der Leyen, about whom we're going to hear a lot more in the next 5 years. You probably all know quite a lot about her already. A few sort of basic facts if her name ever comes up at a dinner party. She's got 7 children, which doesn't leave that much time for drinking. Alternatively, it might actually drive you to drink. It certainly would me. She studied economics at the LSE in London. Actually having to do so under an assumed name because her father, who was a senior politician in Germany at the time, was told that she was on the kidnap list for the Red Army faction. So there she was, having apparently a great time in London. She used to spend less time studying, more time going to clubs. This was the 70s. She was a fan of the Buzzcocks, a band which may not be familiar to many of you in the audience. She's obviously moved on. Now, we like to think, we look at her and say, okay, she spent time in Britain, she must be fond of Britain. I'm sure she is, but, her first loyalty is to the European Union, I suppose in a sense to Germany, although in fact it was Emmanuel Macron, the French president, who was instrumental in putting her into the post. And she's got, in a sense, for Brussels, Brexit is a kind of legacy issue. They want to get it out of the way. It's complicating things. It's slowing things down. It's creating all these kind of legal uncertainties. The caravan is moving on. So her first problem, or her first priority, is getting her new commission through the hearings in the European Parliament. Got off to a slightly tricky start. To lose one commissioner before anything's even started might be considered unfortunate. To lose 2, as she's done, the Hungarian and Romanian ones, is looking a little bit careless. So they've been replaced. The French candidate, Sylvie Goulard, yesterday had a little bit of problems herself relating to past alleged financial misdemeanors, which she retired as defense minister to fight. So that process is going to be continuing in the next few weeks. Then presumably the new commission will be up and running. They've got a lot of priorities. They want to be a lot greener, a lot more sustainable. They do also have to find a way, I think, of bringing back on board all those people that voted for the populists and so on. But as ever, what is going to be the most important thing? The most important thing is going to be the state of the European economy. Now, you probably in the business world know much better than I do that it's not going very well at the moment. The growth forecasts, I think, that were consensus used to be around 2% for 2019. We're now down to about 1% or so. People are talking about stall speed growth. The last couple of days have brought some extraordinarily bad economic news, mostly in the manufacturing sector in the US, elsewhere. The stock markets has suffered a bit of a bruising day yesterday. I haven't really dared check how things are going today. Not necessarily that much better, I think. Now, we have Mario Draghi, the outgoing chief of the European Central Bank, who famously back in 2012 declared that he would do all it took to save the euro. Save the euro he did indeed. And he's advocating, in a sense, more of those policies before going, essentially increasingly negative interest rates, large-scale purchases of securities. That kind of policy was effective then for averting crisis. Whether it's actually effective in dealing with recession or the threat of recession, financial instability, not getting the economy going, is anyone's business. I think the consensus is that it isn't enough. Also that it's having all sorts of side effects, not least in boosting, or say in pushing down interest rates, which have all sorts of knock-on effects through the economy, and also in pushing up asset prices, which is great for someone like myself, who bought themselves a very nice house in London 20 years ago, but is not very good for my own kids, who are now trying to do the same, and of course finding that they can't. And this is all being made worse by what is going on beyond, who's he? Oh, there we go. What's going on beyond Europe's borders, and the challenges that they face or that Europe faces as a result of those. Obviously, we've had the trade tensions between America and China, trade war, I suppose you could call it really, by now, which is spilling over into America's relations with Europe, the threat of reprisals against Airbus, which have just been approved, and of course then the EU will get its approval for reprisals against Boeing, so it'll go on. And then we have the broader attempts by Vladimir Putin to meddle, I think is not too strong a word for it, in what is going on in politics in various European countries, which I cover in my book, which was mentioned kindly earlier, which I think a few of you might have been given copies of. And also the rise of China, the whole Silk Road initiative of China, the attempt by them to sign up different European countries on a sort of a one-by-one basis. All three, I think, that unites these three delightful gentlemen is a desire to somehow not be faced with a united Europe, but be able on an economic and on a political level to do deals with individual countries, but in a sense to sort of use one against the other, particularly smaller countries in Central and Eastern Europe, which are obviously especially vital, or especially vulnerable, rather. So ultimately, I think the main challenge facing Europe is an economic challenge. The country which, of course, is the key to this, is always the key to so many things in Europe, is Germany, at the moment run by Angela Merkel, as it has been since 2005, an extraordinary achievement. She is due to step down in 2021 at the latest. She said she will serve until the next election, may come earlier than that. So, in a sense, as long as she's been there, she has been prevailing over a policy fairly centrist in many respects, but also quite a conservative economic policy, under which essentially Germany is preserving the so-called Schwarze Null, the black zero, which means balancing the books. In fact, more than balancing the books, Germany in the first 6 months of this year has a surplus of about 45 billion euros, about 40 billion pounds, a huge amount of money. There's a great reluctance to open the purse strings, great reluctance to spend, and there have been kind of calls from all over Europe towards Germany to open up, to invest in infrastructure, which actually is not at all what one would expect it to be in Germany. I think as a foreigner, one's quite surprised going there. It's not just the Berlin airport, which has been standing there unopened for I don't know quite how many years, but the trains are late, a lot of other roads are crumbling, bridges are crumbling. There is a great need to invest. Now, Merkel, as I said, won't be there forever. Her successor, or let's say the woman we presume she would like to succeed her, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer. There we go. Now, don't get me wrong, she's not moonlighting as a cleaning lady, but like all German politicians, or many German politicians from the Catholic parts of the country, she goes to Carnival. So there she is from her appearance at Carnival. She is expected generally, I think, to maintain Merkel's stance on a lot of issues, perhaps to be a little bit more conservative on social issues. A more free market approach, I think, is likely if Friedrich Merz, another minister, another great Carnival dresser-upper, comes in. He's currently working for BlackRock, so he would have to give up rather a large salary after unsuccessfully trying to get the leadership of the party last December. And finally, a kind of compromise candidate, a guy called Armin Laschet. Sadly, doesn't seem to dress up, but there he is anyway. Who knows? That ultimately is, I think, the thing to watch for in the coming months. It'll be clearer in Germany whether the coalition survives, I think, beyond the end of this year, in a month or so's time. That rather inconclusively concludes my ramble around Europe. I think we have a few moments for questions, which I'd be happy to take if you have any. Thank you.
You can choose a shade of green.
Right. I think I'm here.
So, thank you very much, Peter. I think there were a number of key messages in your ramblings, whether 7 children promote or work against drinking. Boris on a unicorn and a kamikaze light in your eyes. I suppose just one question that we have here, and it's probably apt that we're meeting when we are, so nothing like putting you on the spot. I think we've seen some of the UK proposals. We haven't seen the European reaction as of yet. But given what we've seen and what we know, do you think we're more likely or less likely to see the bones of a deal?
Let's say it's difficult because Boris Johnson has obviously got 2 audiences that he's playing to. He's playing to his domestic audience, and within it, the Tory party, with whom, in order to bolster his position, he has to stir things up as much as possible and be as belligerent as possible and be in a sense, campaign mode. And he's got the Europeans, he's got the EU, with whom he has to be, he wants to do a deal. I think there is no doubt that he wants to do a deal, and there is no doubt that they want to do a deal. Okay. But I think also there is no doubt that both of them think a deal is unlikely to be achieved, and if it isn't achieved, they want the other one to be blamed for it not being achieved. So it's a real game of, I don't know quite, is it a game of poker perhaps, a game of bluff? Is it a sort of a game theory? Is it a prisoner's dilemma kind of situation? I mean, it'll be decisive in the next few days. As I said earlier, the frustration before was that Britain hadn't formulated its plans. It's now formulated its plans, but they don't fundamentally solve the Brexit trilemma. They don't create this unicorn, and that's the fundamental problem, that Britain really, if it wants to get a deal, has got to shift. And I think probably ultimately it has got to shift more and more towards a border that runs between Britain and the island of Ireland, which is really the only way of getting round the Good Friday Agreement, getting round the no border infrastructure of any sort between the 2 parts of Ireland.
Can I ask you, just one question about, not about the geopolitics of Europe, but actually about your profession, and
it's a kind word for it.
Vocation. In your book, you talk about when you're heading off to Moscow and you're loading up the car, and it is what we imagine, I think, jobbing reporters throughout Europe are doing. Seen as the conference today, we're looking at insurance in 2030. Where do you see the profession going? I know there's a lot of concern about will people actually pay for the analysis and content, but do you despair? Are you hopeful? Are you that the much derided thing, influencers? Where do you see your professional journalism ending up in the next 10 to 15 years?
I think it's been the last 20 years have been an extraordinary time of extraordinary change for media everywhere. I mean, fundamentally, people want to know what's going on. It's fundamental human curiosity. How do they find out what things are going on? So, I mean, they will continue in almost all countries have state-funded, to some extent, public service broadcasters, certainly in Europe. Those will continue to function. You then have private enterprise media organizations. I mean, in a sense, my newspaper, the Sunday Times, which is part of a group, including the Times as well, we have a subscription-based online presence. So, as far as we have about 500,000 subscribers who pay quite a lot of money every month to read us. And, as far as we're concerned, in a sense, there isn't any fundamental difference between researching and writing a story and printing it on a bit of dead tree or just sending it out electronically. In fact, it's a lot easier to transmit it just by a press of a button and someone picks it up on their phone or the tablet or the computer rather than printing it, sending it in vans across the place. But the whole economics, one can get into the changing nature of the advertising industry. Advertisers don't pay so much online as they would do if they were having that same advert in a printed newspaper. It's all changed, but media organizations will continue in one form or another and will be funded probably more and more by subscription, less and less probably by advertising.
Thanks very much. Una Coleman, who organises our conference today, is very good at seeing around corners, and I think she knew that we were going to be bang out of time. So what we've actually done is we have copies of Peter's book, which will be available, and Peter is very kindly going to stay and sign those. They're going to be available in the concourse outside after lunch. So when we come back from lunch and we have our coffee, Peter's going to be there. There's no charge on the book, so we're providing them for you here. So Peter doesn't have to carry around a little cash box with him. We don't want to do that sort of thing.
Or carry a huge suitcase with all the ones back that no one wants.
So what I'd encourage you is, after you've had your lunch, maybe if you come back and Peter will be there and you can put any specific questions that you have to him there. So can I just ask you in a normal fashion, just to thank Peter for his contribution today. It's been superb, Peter. Thank you.